Hi, my name is Brian Jepson. I'm an editor for O'Reilly, and I'm in charge of Make Magazine's series of books. I've also written a few books myself, including macOS 10 for Unix Geeks. I'm the co-author of that one. And I love hacking gadgets, everything from handheld devices to cell phones and anything else that I can get my hands on, which is why I'm really excited about today's talk. The iPhone is this amazing device, and what's really great about it is it's not just a smartphone where you've got a lightweight operating system and some cool features, but it's actually really a true computer. It runs a slightly scaled down version of macOS 10, and unfortunately, Apple's put a number of restrictions on it that lock away its power. So, like many hackers, Jonathan Zdziarski formed a special affection for the iPhone from the day it was released, and he's played a key role in opening up the iPhone's environment to third-party software development. He's hailed on many geek news sites for opening up the device, and he even led the effort to write some of the first open-source applications for it. Jonathan was also the first to develop an application that takes full advantage of the major iPhone APIs, and this is something that's really near and dear to my heart as a retro gaming geek. It's a portable Nintendo Entertainment System emulator called NES.app. Jonathan often points out that the hacker community has done something remarkable with the iPhone in that it's produced a complete SDK, a base of developers, and even has a really strong distribution chain long before Apple was talking about it. And this isn't one of those cases where you've got an open source community that's duplicating some pre-existing commercial efforts. This is really unique in that Apple's the one who's been lagging behind, and now they're trying to play catch up with the open source community's efforts. And the iPhone, right now, it's at a real pivotal moment. It's the same point that Windows Mobile and Palm OS were at when developers first began embracing those platforms. And as anybody who's used a mobile device and become a real big fan of it, you know that it's really only as good as the developer community is in terms of their contribution and what they have to offer. And so Windows Mobile and Palm OS hit it big because developers could not only write great apps, but they also could easily distribute them using sites like Pocket Gear and Handango. The iPhone now has two massive distribution chains. There's the community installer application, and this is something that gets put on your iPhone by default as soon as you jailbreak it. And reports have it running on over 2 million iPhones. But you've also got the iTunes store, where Apple's official applications are going to be sold through. So the iPhone needs more developers, whether they're enterprise, commercial, or just open source enthusiasts who want to add really cool software to the device. And you can learn all about making software for the device in Jonathan's new book, iPhone Open Application Development. Although it focuses on the Open SDK, a number of readers have already reported that it's real easy for them to adapt it for the official Apple SDK. In today's webcast, Jonathan will cover the first steps you'll take in becoming an iPhone application developer, getting the open source toolchain up and running, and building an app with it. So without further ado, I turn the presentation over to Jonathan. Just give us a moment while we flip the screens and make the transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Let's see. I've gone and accepted the screen. Can you see my screen over there?
We can see it perfectly. So you can
Okay,
minimize
excellent.
the web conferencing window.
Yep. Let me pop these down here. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And there's as Brian was saying, there's a real exciting community having built up around the iPhone. In particular, the open source community over the past 7 or 8 months that the iPhone's been out. And just to give you a very brief history of where the community's been with the iPhone, within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the iPhone's release, we had probably about a dozen individuals who, like Brian said, just found the device amazing, and with this knowledge, this quest for knowledge that seems to be instilled in us to explore new things. This device was found to be one of the most popular and amazing devices that a lot of people have seen in quite a while. And so naturally, you had a group of hackers who really wanted to dig in and find out what made this device tick. And so within the first couple of weeks, we had a few dozen people issue the first jailbreak for the device. And I'm going to use that word a lot over this session, so I want to make sure everyone understands what jailbreaking is. There are two ways to modify your iPhone. One, as you're probably very well aware of, is unlocking, which allows it to run on a third-party network. And unlocking is a very low-level modification to the phone. There have been a couple of bad unlocks that have been released in the past that have ended up at least temporarily bricking people's phones. So it's somewhat dangerous, but the unlocking process is what you want to do to run your iPhone on some other network that's not approved by AT&T. What we're dealing here with today, for the most part, in the realms of software development, is jailbreaking. And jailbreaking is entirely different from unlocking in that jailbreaking is basically modifying the iPhone so that you have access to the low-level operating system. And what that allows you to do is install your own software. It allows you to build third-party software without necessarily using any official tools from Apple. It also allows you to install one of the many pre-built software environments that have been created in the open source community for the iPhone. One of them is the Unix world that we've built one of them is the Unix world that we've built for Leopard here. I'm trying to close this text window, it just keeps popping back up here. You see that? Anyway, the other environment, so to speak, is more the end user environment. The Unix environment is great for your typical hacker and your Unix admin type people. What most there's that window again. What most people are going to be running as end users on their device, however, is a third-party community installer. And it's on its way to being open source. As of right now, the code is just terribly ugly, and I've been told by the author that he wants to clean it up before he releases the code. But what this is the community distribution chain, basically, the community distribution source for listing open source applications or shareware or, basically whatever application is out there today. You'll find listed in one of the repositories that this community installer hosts inside of it. So the jailbreaking process in general is commonly referred to as the process by which an end user can run a very simple piece of software, and it will put this little installer icon on the iPhone, and then from there you'll be able to basically install anything that you want to that's listed with one of these repositories. So just to give you a very brief overview of the end user environment, because that's kind of the first step we got to get past before we can even get to development, is how do you actually get in your device? How are the end users that you're writing software for today, at least, getting into their iPhone and putting software on it? And as Brian had noted, it's been estimated that anywhere near 2 million people have already gone through the jailbreak process and installed this community installer on their device. A lot of those people did it to unlock, whereas a lot of those people are also running third-party software. Within the first couple of weeks of releasing the jailbreakme.com website, we had 1 million people, and that was last fall, within just a few weeks, go to this website, and this website allowed people to jailbreak their own iPhone directly from a web page, and it also happened to fix some security vulnerabilities that we had to come across. And so there's a huge open source community around this iPhone, and this is how your end users, if you're writing software, are going to see their iPhone to jailbreak it. One of the more popular recent programs that's out there today is called iLiberty, and it's available for both Windows and for Mac. And as you can see, it's a very simple interface. If you want to jailbreak your iPhone, basically you download this tool from the website listed in Safari, and you click the little jailbreak checkbox, and that's it. You click Free My 8 Gig iPhone, or whatever iPhone iPhone you've got. And then that goes through the process of rebooting your phone. It does a couple of little fun things to it. And then when it comes back up, it will have this community installer built onto it. The community installer was designed by a company called Null River, and it's long since become the dominant installer. And essentially what it is, as you can see in this image at the top, is it lists all of the different software that's available, and your end user is going to tap on whatever it is that they want to install, and it's going to get installed on the phone. So it's a very simple application, as you can see, very easy to use. So that's the first step, and this is what you're going to need to do as a developer to gain access to your device. And as we get into the open source toolchain in the next few minutes, you're going to need to have a jailbroken iPhone that's already running SSH on the device. And to do that, you would go through this iLiberty tool, and you would you would jailbreak your device, and then you would go to this window in this installer app, and you would install what's called the BSD subsystem, and then you install SSH on top of that. So I'm not going to waste anyone's time walking you through the process. Chances are most of you who are developing, who are on this call, have already at least gotten this far. So anyway, that's the introduction to how we're going to proceed today. And what we're going to do today is just a very simple demonstration of installing the open source toolchain on a Leopard desktop. And there are two different ways to write applications on the iPhone. As you know, Apple has released their SDK as of last month, and that is the sort of official way in terms of if you want to write software that's going to be available in the iTunes App Store come June, that's the venue that you're going to need to use. What Apple seems to be slightly amused of is also what the open source community has embraced, I guess you could say, over the past several months, is this open source development channel. And if you're looking to write applications for the iPhone today, the open source channel really is the only way that you can write these applications and get them on the phone. Unless you're currently in the developer program, you don't have access to the keys that you need to do debugging and whatnot. You don't have access to the 1.2 or the 2.0 firmware unless you're pirating it. So it's pretty much assumed that if you want to do anything, write any legitimate software for iPhones today through June, you're going to need to use the open source toolchain. Now, come June, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens because the open source community has taken a look at the Apple SDK offering, and many of them have decided that they want to stay on the open source side of things, and not so much just for the sake of being open source. That is, you can write any kind of software you want. It's just the toolchain that's open source. But because the open source toolchain appears to be more powerful, at least right now, than the Apple SDK, and it's very interesting to us, at least, to have seen such a low-level set of frameworks not be included with the Apple SDK. And just to give you a very simple idea of what the differences are between the two, obviously, if you've seen any of the demos that Apple's put on, you can write some pretty good apps with the Apple SDK. There's no question about that. There are a lot of restrictions, though, that may eliminate your application in terms of being a viable tool in the App Store. And one of the biggest complaints that I hear is the inability to run your applications in the background. Granted, right now the Apple SDK is still in beta, and so we're hoping, of course, that applications running in the background might be allowed at some point. As of today, if you're writing an instant messaging application or some type of buddy finder or something to that effect, you're going to run into some issues with your software running in the background using the Apple SDK. On the other hand, the open source toolchain takes advantage of a more lower-level framework and allows you to actually do pretty much what Apple can do with their own software. That includes the running in the background. It also includes accessing a lot of the low-level frameworks that are on the device. Just to give you a couple more examples, the Core Surface framework is a framework that's designed for the iPhone to do direct writing to a screen surface. And it's what I use when I wrote my Nintendo emulator, because it allows you to do very high performance graphics refreshing on the iPhone screen. The problem is the Apple SDK does not allow you to use that framework. There are other graphical frameworks available, but they either will not allow you to write directly to the screen, or they will not allow you to write to the screen with the level of performance that you can with the core Surface framework. So if you're looking to write, for example, a movie player or some other type of high-performance application that needs to do a very fast frame refresh, unless you're working on a GL application, which is more of a 3D environment, you're going to no doubt run into some issues with performance. There are also several other pieces to the Apple SDK that we've been sad to see gone that are still available in the open source toolchain. And some of these also include the ability to display your own preferences windows, for example. The official Apple documentation recommends that you create a settings bundle, which is available in the settings application, and that is useful for probably 90% of the applications. But again, there is this need by certain apps to be able to change their settings in real time without having to terminate and come back to it. So I'm not going to get too much deeper into the differences, but there are some differences between the two that make the open source toolchain right now a potentially more powerful solution in terms of what you want to do with your application. If you're looking to write a high-performance app, or if you're looking to run in the background, if you're writing an instant messenger or something to that effect, and you need some of these APIs that are just not available with the Apple SDK, then the open source toolchain is a good alternative, and you've also got a significant amount of coverage at this point. If those numbers are accurate that have been quoted before, then you're looking at potentially 40% of the market that is already running third-party freeware and shareware on their devices. So, with that said, let's get started. I'm not going to walk through and sit you through all of the compiler work that's going on. I will walk you through the basic instructions, and this is going to be sort of like a cooking show, I guess, where I'm going to pull some of these pre-compiled versions out of the oven and install them for you. But I wanted to at least get you familiar with how the open source toolchain installs. And for those of you who don't want to have to build it yourself from sources, and granted it's going to be very difficult to follow along on this phone call, I've created a tarball of the open source components of the toolchain that any of you may download from the URL that you see on the screen. And it's the very first file right here. It's a 50 meg file, and it's called FOSS Toolchain. And you're free to download that. That will come in the form of a bzip tarball. You can basically extract that and copy it into your user local directory. And at that point, you'll have a pretty good majority of the toolchain already set up. After you extract that, what you should see in your directory is basically what we're going to see here after we get done with some of these steps. So I'm just going to walk you real quickly through. There are two different pieces that you're going to need to build the toolchain. And one of them is the LLV on the low-level virtual machine. And it's basically a compiler framework that's used to bootstrap compilers into an environment where they share the same uniformity with other compilers and whatnot. And it's also a very useful framework for building cross-compilers from the ground up. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to download this LLVM framework from a Subversion repository. And your Mac should already come with Subversion sitting on it. So essentially, all you'll need to do is type in this command. And if you'd like to follow along, by the way, I will point you to the website where you can find this documentation online. You go down to iPhoneDev.org, and then you click on Wiki. That's going to take you to this wiki. And then from here, the second option down, is what's going to allow you to build the toolchain with both support for the current version of the iPhone software and the next version of the iPhone software. And it's essentially the same thing that I'm using here. So I'll leave this URL up for a brief minute here. And you've got this subversion repository, and then the open source toolchain you'll find sitting here in the second repository. And we're just going to go and grab both of these. And while that's going on and downloading, I'm just going to take a few minutes here and hit maybe with some of these questions if you have any questions while we're downloading this, specifically about the open source toolchain or any of the big differences between the Apple SDK and whatnot. And Catherine,
Yeah, I have. Well, the first question that someone asked was, how do you? Can you hear me, Brian?
I can hear you.
Okay, the first question that we got, someone asked how you feel about Z Phone 3.0 as iPhone?
Okay. Yeah, iPhone. Right, iPhone, Z Phone. I'm not exactly sure how
Probably
how they're pronouncing it these days. iPhone has an interesting story in that it originated from the research originated from the dev team. It was actually written by probably half a dozen developers in the dev team, and then we had one dev team member be asked to leave. So there's a lot of drama involved here, but apparently what happened is a lot of that research that was sitting in a subversion repository wound up getting released as iPhone. The one thing that I would strongly caution people, if you're going to use iPhone, is that it contains a fair amount, and this wasn't done by the dev team, this was done by the person who released it, but it contains a fair amount of Apple intellectual property. In other words, rather than write this tool to use some of the more proper methods to accomplish the jailbreaking and the unlocking, the author has actually included some copyrighted code, and so that's why I've stayed away from it. That's why I usually recommend people stay away from it. Given that it does work, however, it works very well. iLiberty is another tool very similar to iPhone. It uses a lot of the same techniques to jailbreak and unlock the device. As far as I can tell, iLiberty doesn't include any copyrighted works either, so it's a much safer, much more legal solution to use in terms of jailbreaking your phone. And that is something I wanted to touch on for the next minute or so, if I could, is just to add in, so far in terms of jailbreaking and unlocking, in the United States, now none of us are lawyers here and we make no attempt to give legal advice, but it's generally been accepted that jailbreaking and unlocking are both legal here in the United States. You should still, of course, check all of your local and state laws. You should still make sure, especially if you're outside the country, that what you're doing in terms of, hacking into your own iPhone and writing software and whatnot, you should make sure that that it's legal wherever you are. But it is generally accepted to be legal. The DMCA actually makes an exemption specifically for unlocking, as well as fixing some of the security vulnerabilities that we fixed on the device. So unless you're in this game to steal IP, unless you're hacking into the iPhone to steal Apple software or to steal some other software, for the most part, you're generally safe in the United States. But I would strongly caution everyone to try and stay away from some of the tools out there that are using either ripped-off stolen pieces of code from Apple or some of the wares copies that are out there of the 2.0 firmware and whatnot. Other than being enormously unstable, of course they're also illegal, and it's kind of gotten to the point where it's starting to give software development on the iPhone a bad name. So we're trying to do the best we can to protect the artful style of hacking, the honorable hacking in terms of just getting into your phone and playing with things and seeing how it works as it's been done for the past several decades. So this is still downloading. Catherine, did you have another question you wanted to run? And then we'll get started?
Yes, there were a couple of early questions about the installer that you used, and a couple of people mentioned something called Cydia, C-Y-D-I-A.
Cydia, I think is how it's pronounced.
All right. I'm not familiar with it. And
well,
for
it's
instance,
interesting because you chat in the chat room and you hear all these names, but you never actually talk in person to anybody, so you have no idea how they're pronounced.
Right. So they were surprised that you presented the one you did instead of this one, Cydia.
Right. Well, Cydia is relatively new, and I'm very excited to see how it turns out. And in fact, I've been told that there's a very good chance that Cydia will, in the future, if it doesn't already, in the future support an actual pay-to-play type application store, where not only will you be able to download freeware and shareware like you do through the current installer, but you'll also be able to sell commercial or shareware, or you'll be able to charge to download and install your product. And if they can get that together, then not only will we have a great community market share that we've got already, but we'll also be able to basically compete with the App Store, with the Apple App Store. And as everybody on the call probably knows, competition is good when you're talking about technology. It helps to make a better product. In fact, I think the reason we've got such a decent initial offering from Apple for this SDK is because of the competition that's already arisen from the open source community. So I'm excited about Cydia, but it is still relatively new. It's definitely something worth looking at, and you can Google that if you wanted to check it out. I can't say that I know enough about it yet to be able to recommend it. Most folks right now are still using the installer application at this point, but I would like to see that grow because some of the things I heard about it are very exciting. So
okay.
It looks like I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, before we go on, here's a question. I think it's important. One person wrote, I'm already developing apps for the official Apple iPhone SDK. If I jailbreak my phone or release software written using the open source toolchain, do I risk Apple yanking my iPhone SDK license?
Okay, well, that's a fair question. And yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I'll give you my take on this. But if you're really interested in an answer, you should definitely talk to Apple. But from what I've seen and heard, the Apple SDK license agreement, and also potentially the developer program agreement, which the developer program is not what I am currently a part of, because that would bind me to a lot of confidentiality agreements, as would downloading the Apple SDK and using it. So I'm speaking from a third-party perspective here. But my take on this situation is that the current Apple agreements restrict you in terms of what you do with their Apple SDK, and restrict you in terms of what you release between now and June using Apple's SDK. I haven't seen anything that tries to restrict use on another type of development environment or another set of developer tools. And in fact, I'm not entirely sure if that would even be legal. That would be like me selling you a piece of software, saying if you're going to use my software, then you are restricted from using my competitor's software. And I don't believe that's legal to do. The open source toolchain does not have any legal restrictions on it. It's completely unencumbered. So in terms of what you do with the open source toolchain, you have no restrictions whatsoever, with the exception of, obeying the law and whatnot. When you're using the Apple SDK, however, there are a lot of restrictions in terms of what they allow you to do with it. And a lot of what you're going to see in terms of using private APIs, and there's a good chunk of code in my book, for example, that covers a lot of otherwise private APIs. You can technically take advantage of them in the Apple SDK. However, that violates your use agreement with Apple. So I can't encourage you to do that, which is one of the reasons that a lot of people are behind the open source toolchain, is you have the same objects available to you. The problem is Apple has restricted you from using a lot of them. But to answer your question directly, I can't imagine that would be the case. I don't know if that would be enforceable. I certainly don't believe it's ethical. But if you're concerned about whether or not using both of them together would cause you to be ejected out of the program, I would definitely ask Apple about that. And I'd be interested to hear if anything came of that.
Okay. That's all we have for now, Jonathan.
Okay. So we're kind of chewing up a lot of time here. Rather than sitting and actually going through the configure, it may make more sense to just sort of show you the finished product, so to speak, instead of actually going through this and compiling. And most of you are pretty familiar with what you're needing to do to get any software installed in a Unix world. Is you have a set of configure parameters that you pass, and you do makes, and you install. For those of you who are sort of following along in the book, the instructions that I'm displaying here are virtually identical, with the exception of one new piece that we've since added. And this will eventually be worked into the subversion, the main branch. But for now, what we've done, and I've highlighted the line here, is there is a new set of ODCC tools that has been developed by Jay Freeman, also known as Soric, if you're in some of these chat rooms. And what he's done is he's taken these tools and he has updated them so that you can now build applications using the open source toolchain for both the 1.1, 1.0 firmware, which is what everybody's running today, and you can also, with a couple of different flags, you can also compile your application so that they will link against the 2.0 firmware when it's available. If you are running the Apple SDK, or if you have the 2.0 firmware and you're allowed to, you can essentially swap out the frameworks and the libraries that you're linking against in the open source toolchain against that set of libraries and frameworks. And essentially what you'll end up with is a fully functional open source compiler that works on 2.0. So for those of you who are interested in building that support in, if you've been following along with the book, or if you've got a build currently sitting in your Subversion repository, after you've checked these out, the only other piece that you'll want to do is you'll want to go into the ODCC tools directory, and you'll execute an SVN switch. And again, I've highlighted this here. And basically what it does is it switches out that part of the repository on your local drive so that it downloads from a different repository. And from there, and I'll show you in the end here, when you compile your application, you'll basically be providing a couple of different flags if you want to build against 2.0. And that will provide you with what you need to be able to link against the new linking ABI that is being used in the new firmware. As I said, I don't want to walk you through all of this building and configuring. It's actually relatively simple and relatively straightforward. If you're on Leopard, then you're going to be sitting here executing these commands just in the same order. And now would be a good time to probably bookmark this page if you're looking at it right here. What you'll end up with, of course, is the compiler installed on your Leopard machine. And after you get that installed, that's great, but do you know what to do with it? And so the next thing I'm going to show you is, let's assume that we've got this compiler installed here. I just can't get rid of this text window. You've got this compiler installed here, and you've got your application code. So the next question is, how do you actually compile your code? This is an example of what you're looking at here is the NESApp source code. And I've written various make files depending on what it is you're using. You can actually, if you wanted to, compile it with the SDK, or you can compile it with the open toolchain. It's all according to whatever you're licensed to do. And I'll give you an example of what your typical open source toolchain make file is going to look like. And it's very straightforward. And if you've already pulled out the tarball, you should have these paths there. But essentially, you'll see that the compiler, the cross compiler that you're going to want to use is ARM Apple Darwin GCC, and that is the cross compiler that will build your binary for the iPhone platform, which is running, of course, the ARM processor. From there are only a few things that you actually need to do to build any application, and I'll tell you what, I'll even show you an easier example. So let's not complicate this at all, really. here's a very simple example of what you need to do. And really, the only difference between compiling an application for your Mac using GCC or compiling it for your iPhone is essentially you want to use ARM Apple Darwin GCC instead of GCC, and you want to be linking to the Objective-C library that is essentially on your iPhone. And I'll show you in just a minute how you can grab the files that you need from the iPhone to be able to link against them on your desktop. But the Objective-C framework, of course, is what's going to allow you to compile and use the Objective-C applications that are on the iPhone. From there, there's a series of frameworks, and there are numerous examples of source code out there. This is one example from my book on using Coarse Surface to render graphics directly to the screen. But there are a number of different frameworks, and if you want to include a particular framework, the Dash framework flag is pretty proprietary to Leopard, or proprietary to Mac, I guess I should say. But it includes, it uses a different path as opposed to using libraries. And when you use framework, it will grab that framework and link to it out of system libraries, system library frameworks, or system library private frameworks. And so you're going to need to understand, what all of the different frameworks do. And there's, as I said, there's plenty of documentation out there. In terms of anything else, that's pretty much all there is to it. You really are just compiling it just like a regular GCC program. The big difference that you're going to run into, and what you're going to need to add to your existing toolchain, if you've downloaded the tarball, for example, or if you're building this from source, is you're going to need a copy of your iPhone's local libraries and frameworks, because you can't compile, or you can compile, but you can't link against something unless you have libraries to link against. So I'm going to create the default. All of these instructions use user local share iPhone file system as a default for where it's going to be looking for these different libraries and whatnot. And after you've gone and extracted that tarball or installed from sources, you're going to need to grab these frameworks from the iPhone. So the easiest way to do that is using SCP. And if you're going to need an iPhone with SCP installed. But essentially, you would want to use SCP to the IP address of your iPhone, and then you'll be wanting to fetch system library frameworks from the iPhone and put them in the current directory. And then from there, you'll be basically doing the same thing for system library private frameworks, and that will SCP the private frameworks directory here. And then finally, you're going to want to grab user lib. Now, once you get them into your directory, you're going to need to put them into system library and into user within this directory. So, for example, let's say you've downloaded these now. What you would do is you would create a user directory locally here. And so you're in user local share iPhone file system. So your user directory is going to be user local share iPhone file system user. And you also want to create system library. And then at that point, you can move your frameworks and your private frameworks directories into system library and move lib into user. At that point, you're going to have pretty much everything you need to build your application. The ARM Apple Darwin GCC compiler can be found in user local bin. So if you haven't already added user local bin to your path in, say, .profile, you could add it to your .profile, or you could easily just add it directly, for example, like that. That way you can access, just call the file name of the compiler without having to supply a path. So what does this all look like when you're finished? Well, just to give you an example, let's build an application just for fun. And we've got our make file here. I'll show it to you again. And I've actually installed mine, instead of installing mine into user local, I've actually gone and stuck mine into developer platform's iPhone FOSS platform. A lot of people seem to have found that to be a little more in line with how Apple's done their SDK, and so there's actually a platform directory available as well if you wanted to do the same. Instead of downloading that first tarball, you can download this iPhone FOSS platform tarball, which is essentially the same thing, only you can stick it in developer platform, and you'll have the toolchain sitting in that directory instead. It doesn't really matter where you put it. What's important is that you can get to it pretty easily, and that it's not competing with the rest of your file system wherever you've got it installed. So this is a makefile for NESApp, and uses the ARM Apple Darwin GCC compiler again, and we're going to just build against it. And as you can see, the compiler goes and it will crunch all of the object files, and what you end up with is an output binary once it's done compiling. Now, the makefile that I'm using will actually prepare the application after this. But what you're going to end up with essentially, and just to use the example here, is all the compiler's going to give you is your binary. Well, if you want to get a GUI application on the iPhone, you've actually got to have an app folder. And just like on the Leopard desktop, your .app folder goes into /applications on the iPhone. And so inside that app folder now, you've got your binary, which is what the compiler spat out. You're also going to want an info plist file. And this goes right in the app folder again. And basically the info plist file provides information about what your application is doing, what the executable file name is going to be, here, let me highlight some of these here. This is CF bundle executable, and that's basically going to be the file name of your binary that's sitting in that folder. When your application is launched, that binary is it's going to get called. And then underneath that, you can see CF bundle identifier. The CF bundle identifier is just the identifier that you want to assign to your application, which is how Springboard and a lot of the other applications running on the iPhone know about your application. So you're going to need a plist file like this, and there are several examples out there. There's an example in the book. You can steal the one from NESApp if you like, and just tailor it to what you need. Those are the two things you're at the very least going to need inside your app folder in order for your program to be identified by Springboard. In addition to that, there is a file called default.png. And basically what that is it's an image that reflects what is going to, when your application is launched and you see it zoomed to the front of the iPhone, whatever you want to be in that zoomed picture is what you want to put in default PNG. Most people will use just a blank, like a black screen or a white screen. Other people have gone and added some pretty nice little effects. And that default file basically acts like the backdrop until you start drawing more windows on top of them in your application. If you don't provide a default PNG, your app will still work, but the iPhone will pick the absolute ugliest background to you. So it's a good idea to at least supply, a blank one if you're not going to use it. And the fourth and final thing that you're going to need for your application, of course, is an icon. If you don't supply an icon, again, Apple will use, or the iPhone will use the ugliest possible icon it can find in its library. So just you use a 59 by 59 PNG, seems to be what the standard is. So you have these four files. Let's say you have your app folder, nest.app. At this point, you're ready to upload your application to the iPhone, and this can be done very easily via SCP. And that's pretty much all you need to do at that point. After you SCP the application folder over, you can actually log into the iPhone. You can either reboot the iPhone to load that application on the Springboard, or you can kill the Springboard process using a kill-all Springboard, essentially, and I'll type that out so you can see it. But once you do one of those two things, your application will immediately be available. And unfortunately, I can't really show you the front of my iPhone here because this is, of course, a desktop-based software. But what you would see, of course, is you turn the iPhone on, and you've got your little icon right on the Springboard, just like all the other applications. You tap it, and it zooms to the front, and it acts just like any other application. So that's your basic low-level introduction in terms of how applications are built on the iPhone. As I said, this is not what the end user sees. What the end user ends up seeing is a pretty little installer app, and your application will be listed in one of the categories that are in the installer. And at that point, they can just tap it, install it right over the air, and enjoy it. So while this may look like a quite a large solution, quite a large effort on your side, by the time it actually gets to the end user, it's a very simple process. So with that, I hope if anyone's still awake, hopefully I haven't put anyone to sleep, but I would be glad to take any questions you've got about the open source toolchain or any of the differences between the two SDKs or what have you. Catherine, if you wanted to throw some questions at me.
Okay, I think you've answered a lot of the questions that people have asked. One person's asking, you probably saw that, do I need to have a Mac to do iPhone development of any kind?
Good question. The Apple SDK will only run on a Mac running Leopard, but the open source toolchain can build on any recent version of macOS, which I believe includes Tiger, Leopard, Panther. It will also run under Linux, and there are some Cygwin builds under there running under Windows. I don't have URLs directly to the Cygwin build, but I do believe that there are instructions for building the Linux build right on the iPhone Dev website that you can check out. This is also, because it's an open source compiler, as long as you're not including any of the components from the iPhone on there, it's perfectly legal to distribute a binary version of it. And so you can go and search around for a binary Cygwin toolchain or what have you. But that's one of the benefits to being able to run the open source toolchain is you don't have to go out and buy expensive hardware.
Okay. A couple people have asked about debugging. One person said, are you going to cover it all?
Sure. Well, the reason everyone's probably asking about it is because there is no debugging whatsoever. And part of the problem is the iPhone firmware, as it is right now in today's production version of 1.14, doesn't include the necessary kernel pieces that we need in order to run something like GDB. We have tried. There's been a very significant effort to do debugging. Right now, no matter what you're using to develop on 1.1, there is just no way you're going to debug outside of doing, printfs and things of that nature. The 2.0 firmware, however, and the 1.2 firmware, does have a GDB framework built in. And one of the great things that I love about Xcode is that they've actually worked the debugging right into Xcode. So you can build your application, you can send it over to the iPhone, and you can debug it right inside of Xcode. And you should be able to do that regardless of which compiler you're using as well. Now, in terms of, there's obviously a demarc between what you're able to do on a technical level and what you're able to do on a licensing level. And you should, of course, if you're thinking about doing something, you should ask Apple if it's okay if you're not sure about it. However, from what I understand, Xcode in and of itself is separately licensed from the SDK compiler. So it may or may not be appropriate on a licensing level to use the open source toolchain and use Xcode to debug as well. That's something you'd have to check with Apple. The other thing to consider also is if you're using the Apple SDK to write your apps, you have the technical ability to use some of the private APIs that the open source toolchain is using, and there are numerous how-tos on how to do that, which would also allow you to debug your application. But you will need to talk to Apple about getting permission to use those frameworks before they will license that capability to you. So on a technical level, these two are very similar, but I wanted to put the warning out there, though, that if you're concerned about the licensing aspect of it, you're probably going to want to consult Apple in terms of what you're actually allowed to do. Okay. Once 2.0 is released, and I'll add on, once 2.0 is officially released, we'll likely have a GDB debugger as well inside the open source toolchain that will likely work with the GDB framework on the phone.
Okay. Let me see. there were a couple other questions. One person asked, and you may have covered this, how do we get the 2.0 firmware?
Right. Well, I'm hoping that he's asking how to get it legally. Legally, what you need to do is sign up with Apple as a developer, and once you're accepted into the developer program, I believe you have that accessible to you. I'm not entirely certain if that's specific to just the enterprise program or both. I think it may just be the enterprise, but that is right now the only legal channel that you can obtain 2.0 from. If you're not in the program, you're just going to have to wait for 2.0 to come out, and I don't know if they're actually going to release that in June or if they're going to release a transitional version of that. I guess we'll see. But right now, the developer program is the only way you're able to legally get a hold of 2.0. And just to add on to that, too, 2.0 has got some restrictions. As a developer, you need to know that you're going to probably want to have a dedicated iPhone if you're going to develop on 2.0 right now. And the reason for that is the 2.0 firmware, as has been muchly advertised on various blogging sites, it does not allow you to make phone calls unless you've previously unlocked your phone, ironically. It also does not allow you to play iTunes music that you've purchased through iTunes. In other words, anything that has DRM built into it. It also has several other technical limitations that make it not viable as a consumer device anymore. And once you've upgraded to the 2.0 firmware, without some pretty severe hacking at least, you're not going to be able to downgrade back to 1.1. So just know that, I encourage you, if you want to be a developer, if you want to get involved in Apple's developer program, that's certainly something I would recommend. However, I would just be aware that you're probably going to want to buy another iPhone to do that as well.
That's great. I think let's answer one more question, and then I think that we'll wrap it up after that. And I want to let people know that there is a forum on the O'Reilly site for Jonathan's book, and you can post questions there, and he's very good about answering them. And we sent you the link in the email that we sent you yesterday, or you can go back to the registration page and get the link there. Let me see. Someone was asking, can you load a compiled app using Toolchain to the simulator Aspen? I have no idea what that means, but
okay,
Jonathan?
That's fine. Yes, you can, except if you're going to build on Aspen specifically, there's a couple things you should probably know. Aspen is a simulator, as you know. It's not called an emulator. And the reason for that is that the frameworks that you're actually using and the way your application is actually built it's actually built for Intel natively. It is not built for the ARM processor. And so what you're running is actually a completely different version of iPhone software that has been compiled specifically for your desktop. And so you can compile applications using private APIs. I misspoke a second ago. You cannot build it with the open source toolchain because the open source toolchain is a cross-compiler. It will only build ARM binaries. You can build it with the Apple SDK version of GCC, and you can, if you have the appropriate licensing, build using the private APIs as opposed to the official SDK APIs. The problem you're going to run into either way is that the simulator, being a simulator, doesn't have all of the pieces that the iPhone itself has in terms of frameworks. And as you've probably seen even too, just writing official applications on the simulator, you don't have access to some of the same pieces. For example, the simulator can't run OpenGL. And part of the reason for that is because the GL framework, as well as a lot of the lower level frameworks that GL relies on, such as Core Surface, are unavailable. They haven't been compiled or distributed by Apple for the simulator. So you're going to run into a lot of issues where you're just unable to use a lot of these private APIs, not because they're broken, just because they're missing. So that's one thing you'll need to keep in mind. The other thing, of course, if you're writing an application that uses any of the things that make the iPhone such a fantastic device, such as the location feature or the accelerometer. If you run it in a simulator, you can't just shake your laptop and kind of get that same result to the simulator. There's no way to really use some of these pieces of hardware that are built into the iPhone without actually running your application on the iPhone. So I would say yes, you can, but I would strongly recommend anybody who's serious about doing development, you really want to get a dedicated iPhone for it. Not only are you going to be able to use a lot more of the pieces to the Apple SDK with it, but you're also going to be able to see just exactly what your app looks like. It is not guaranteed to look the same on the real iPhone. You're just not going to get the same results that you would in the simulator.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And I want to thank everyone else who joined us in the webinar today, the webcast. And I see that people are still asking questions, but I know that Jonathan has to be elsewhere. So please feel free to go to the forum. And again, it's on the email that we sent you and on the webcast page. And you can post your questions there, and Jonathan will answer them. And you can go to his site as well. And I just want to say thank you very much, and thank you, Brian, too.